restoration. This is about the restoration. We love it dearly. We've heard good descriptions about it. It wasn't as clean and perfect and organized as some people like to have it. There are some messy parts about it. It was mentioned that I teach the Gospel Doctrine essays, which deal with some of the K-N-O-T-T-Y naughty issues in the history of our church. That in our information age, through the internet, many of our young people and older people are being drawn away. Probably all of you know people who are being drawn away. And therefore, I got permission in our ward to teach about these gospel topics, essays. And I've dedicated a good share of my life and my ministry to helping people understand that the restoration is still true in spite of all the challenges we face. This W.W. Phelps is a very interesting character, and so I figured today let's have a good time and enjoy ourselves and not worry about a lot of formalities. I'm loosening here, and I've already taken my coat off, and let's just enjoy it. I've come to the conclusion as I've worked on this biography that there is no other person, save Joseph Smith himself, of course, who did more up through 1844, 45, and 46 in promulgating the doctrines of the church and helping people in the church understand its doctrines and the restoration and the connection with ancient events and ancient scriptures with the modern day, and to promote the role of the prophet Joseph Smith. There's no one who did more and more effectively than W.W. Phelps. There were others who were involved, and many who later published things that have become more standard for us. Most people know about this man for two reasons. Alton hymns, 15 in our current hymn book, more than anybody else. And the fact that he came back to the church in forgiveness circumstances where Joseph Smith offered him the right hand of fellowship and invited him back. And it's a beautiful story. Less well known, of course, are the other things that he did that are so very important to understand. He was called as the printer unto the church, and he was the only one in the church in 1831 who even knew how to print and publish and run a printing office and run a printing press and put it all together. He had multiple leadership experiences in the infant church. He had an unending list of theological and historical writings that affected the life of the church. We're going to be emphasizing today, and certainly in the chapter in the book, about the restoration. Let me help you understand that it wasn't just in the evening and the morning star of independence. Most of you have heard about that. And he edited it. But he was the main contributor, really, to the Latter-day Saints Messenger and Advocate during the 11 months they lived in Ireland. And then in Nauvoo, he was the de facto editor, really, once he got there, of the Times and Seasons, and then two other newspapers, the Wasp, and then its successor, the Nauvoo Neighbor. And then in Utah, Deseret, we established the Deseret News with the printing press that he had obtained and purchased himself in Boston. And he operated the printing office. Willard Richards was the nominal editor. He was second consul in the first presidency and Secretary of State in the state of Deseret and then the territory of Utah. And he was so busy that he oversaw what the Deseret News was to do and accomplished and wrote a few things. But once again, Phelps, it was the Deseret News, was the de facto editor there until Richards died in 1854. So he was the main editor and writer of our discourses. It would absolutely astound you to see the length and breadth of it. I have my email address over here. I can only scratch the surface today in showing what he wrote about God and all things. And I thought that at the beginning here, we probably ought to learn a little bit more about him. In Doctrine and Covenants 57, that was given in Land of Zion, as they called it, in Independence, is Jackson County, Missouri. And I'm calling it Missouri because Joseph Smith used that pronunciation, as do many people in the state even now. Verily, verily, I say unto you, let my servant William W. Phelps, he was actually called William in the first edition, be planted in this place and be established as a printer unto the church. And lo, if the world receive his writings, my goodness, there are so many that you wouldn't believe. And behold, here is wisdom, let him obtain whatsoever he can obtain in righteousness for the good of the saints. This photo just really came to light in the last 10 years. Been hidden away in the church archives. I believe this would make him about 56, 57. I was guessing around that time, one of the very first photos. As I've studied his life, and I have done it for a large part of my career, I've recently gotten back into finishing off this biography, but I really strive to put myself in the setting of what's happening. I pretend I'm in Independence. I pretend I'm in Kirtland. I feel I'm in Nauvoo, and I visit these places, of course, and then look at the circumstances and the terrain and the housing and lots of things. Certainly, as the 14 volumes of the Joseph Smith Papers have come out, and much more even published online with the Joseph Smith Papers Project, and Phelps was so intimately connected with Joseph Smith and his teachings and his activities that I felt I'd gotten to know him even more than I did before. I feel I'm right there. I love this man, and yet he was an eccentric and unusual man too. This is a portrayal of him in 1835. Not altogether sure it's correct. As you may know, the Kirtland Temple is in the hands of the Community of Christ, formerly RLDS, in Kirtland, Ohio. They have a visitor center there, and this Henry Inouye, now deceased, painted portraits of each of the 9 presidents of the church. Maybe you didn't even know there were 9 presidents in 1835. Phelps was one of them. I'll try to explain that in a bit. And their wives. And he did finally get to Sally, although we do have something of her. While he was in Kirtland in 1835, Joseph Smith Sr. gave him the patriarchal blessing. This is only part of it, but it's an interesting part. The Lord has looked upon thee from all eternity and known all thy works and ways. Thou art a pure descendant of Joseph and of the blood of Ephraim. Fair enough. Thou art a speckled bird. That's a phrase that comes from the book of Jeremiah also. And a speckled bird would be a bird that other birds peck at and mock and get after. And the Lord hath held thee up to be gazed at. He even referred to himself as a speckled bird later. Thou art a stranger man. The Lord has given thee understanding and knowledge and wisdom and discernment. Good. And thou hast thought thou wast somebody. Thou hast been exalted. In Doctrine and Covenants 59, there's a rebuke of him for taking pride into himself. Nevertheless, if thou continuest faithful and humblest thyself, thou shalt see great things and have greater knowledge. He really was the most learned man in Kirtland in 1835 in the church, and has been acknowledged by several other historians. Thou shalt see the city of Enoch. He loved Enoch, the city, and he was anxious to see it. And shalt gaze upon it in all its glory. Yes, thou shalt be exalted to the heaven, and thou shalt be able to comprehend all hidden mysteries. And he loved that idea. Which have been hid from the foundation of the world. Yea, thou shalt understand things that have not been revealed unto man. And he did speak in favor of Joseph Smith's ideas. One thing that, and I'm going to share any of this, I'm 70 years old, and it's too late to worry about my reputation in the future. And so if you want to get anything that I've been learning about these things, I'm wanting to say this stuff. He was a ghostwriter for Joseph Smith in the times times and seasons. A lot of what we have in the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith comes from the times and seasons in Nauvoo, under the name of Joseph Smith, sure enough, but it is codes written by Phelps, the items in the times and seasons. Joseph Smith Jr. gave him a blessing also. This is the only part of it. Blessed of the Lord is Brother Phelps, for he shall have the desires of his heart and the gift that pertaineth to writing the law of God, and in being an instrument in writing to lift up an ensign to the nations. He shall be a wise lawyer in Israel, for he shall understand the law of the Lord perfectly. And he was commanded in Nauvoo to become really acquainted with all the laws of the land and the basis for legal transactions, like from Blackstone and other famous folks who put together the legal system in Britain and the United States. And the renowned among men shall acknowledge his superior wisdom pertaining to the law of the nations and kingdoms. And Brother Phelps did know a lot, and he exhibited it in his multiple writings. There's an event that is reported, and it's well documented. In 1856, Brigham Young in Deseret, or Utah, brought together a number of advisors and asked several questions about events going on. And they asked Brother Phelps, because he could answer lots of things. And he said to this question, I don't know. And Brigham Young said, mark that out right away. This is the first time I've ever seen Brother Phelps not knowing the answer to something. Kind of mocking way. Like I say, I think this is about 58, 59 maybe. What that be on? Here we go. This is the later one, I think. Probably 60, 62, 63. This one I'm pretty sure is about 70. He was born in 1792, therefore in 1862 he'd be 70, my age. So I've compared a few things about him with me. At that point in time, there were two main things in his life, church life. A lot of things were in the past that he had done, including writing so much for the Deseret News. But he still was the editor and publisher of the Deseret Almanac, the official church publication published by the Deseret News Press. So he edited, put everything in there. Even gathered the advertisements that were in there for the Deseret Almanac that came out every year, including 1862. And he worked in the endowment house. The endowment house usually was open on Fridays for Latter-day Saints to come and be married and sealed and receive their endowment report. There was no other temple. Yeah. The first temple in the West that was finished to allow for endowments was 1877 in St. George. Brigham Young was there for that, but wasn't even there for the other ones that Brigham had planned for in 1884, Logan, 1888, Mantine, 1893, Salt Lake Temple. So the endowment house was the place. Brother Phelps went there every time because he played a role in the temple endowment. In fact, he played the role of the serpent, the devil. Anyway, in 1863, which was just a bit after 1862, but he hadn't quite reached his 71st birthday, which would be February 17th, George Buchanan, president of the British and European missions in Liverpool, was a friend of Brother Phelps, and Brother Cannon kept a really good journal, and this journal now is available online. I don't know if you've heard that, and I got this from that. Monday, February 23rd, 1863, the American mail was delivered this morning. He was in Liverpool. I received a letter from Judge Phelps. He was always known as Judge Phelps in Salt Lake. January 17th, in which he says, I shall be 71 years old 1 month from today. And I can say without the fear of contradiction that the past year has been one of the happiest of my life, without pain or sickness. It's good. And according to the revelation of Joseph had told him that he would not taste of death. I expect to live the next 70 years, improving on the past, and then maybe caught up and changed in the twinkling of an eye. Interesting. I will maybe mention a couple things about that. Yeah. Here's the outside of Almanac 1862. I mean 70 in 1862, and I'm 70 now. And there were the two things that he did. A little bit of writing and work in the temple. Well, I do a little bit of writing and I work in the temple. In the new Provo City Center temple, so we have a similarity there. This is one depiction of what was going on. He dressed up as the devil, the serpent. He did. Every time I do work in the temple, I think of Brother Phelps giving that oration and dismission in Downtown House. But that's my temple now, in which I work and find great opportunity. Artemus Ward, a British traveler, and he wrote a lot about his travels. He was a humorist also, and wrote in humorous vein. He was much like Mark Twain. They had so many similarities. He was from Britain, however. He published his travels among the Mormons, and published it over there in London as he got back in 1865. And the Phelps that he was describing would be basically the one he saw in 1863 when he went through. He dedicated a chapter, Phelps' Almanac, chapter 15, to this unusual man. There is an eccentric Mormon at Salt Lake City of the name of W.W. Phelps. He is from Cortland State of New York and has been a saint for a good many years. You can say from 1831 on. It is said that he enacts the character of the devil with a kid-green tail in the Mormon initiation ceremonies. He also publishes an almanac in which he blends astronomy with short moral essays. That's true. He had lots of little short moral essays, some of them just a line long. He would go through each of the days of the year, and if there wasn't something important for that day that happened, like somebody's important birthday or something that happened in the Restoration or even in the history, then he would put a little proverb of his own on that particular day. He would just tell it. He just did that. Under the head of Old Sayings, Mr. P. Phelps publishes the following. There's a modesty about the last saying which will be pretty apt to strike the reader. The Lord does good and Satan evil, said Moses. Sun and moon see me conquer, said Joshua. Virtue exalts a woman, said David. Fools and folly frolic, said Solomon. Judgments belong to God, said Isaiah. The path of the just is plain, said Jeremiah. The soul that sins dies, said Ezekiel. This is, you see in the Almanac. The wicked do wicked, said Daniel. Ephraim fled and hid, said Hosea. The Gentiles war and waste, said Joel. The second rain is peace and plenty, said Amos. Zion in the house of the God, said Obadiah. A fish saved me, said Jonah. Our line will be terrible, said Micah. Doctor, cure yourself, said the Savior. Live to live again, said W.W. Phelps. He put himself in there for the rest of his life. I'm going to show you the last three letters that he wrote. It looks like at the end of 1866, beginning of 1867, he bows out of sight, dementia, until he died in 1872. This one is March 20th of 1866. President Young, I have just completed the compilation of an almanac embracing 1866 and 1867 in one volume. Well, this is March in 1866. I think he probably had slowed down and wasn't ready for 1866 at the latter end of 1865. I'm just surmising that. But now he had finished and had 1867 in one volume, and I greatly need the avails of it for a living. Will you assist me in getting it published? Brother Godby had, and he was a British-born businessman who had become wealthy in Salt Lake City. Brother Godby has promised me $50 toward its publication. You can have that, and there is a call for the balance in the publication, and a loan will be realized. But you've got to understand, I'm not just begging here. I don't want to be considered a beggar. I labor in the endowments, which he still did, I guess, and get but little and need some more to make my family comfortable. At age 70, they didn't have Social Security. In comparison with me, I've got plenty of money because I get Social Security and my pension from BYU, and I have plenty. But he didn't. And in my 75th year, I am not able to labor much. If you will help me and let Brother George Q. Cannon, by this point he had come back and taken over the publishing of the Desert News Press, superintend the affairs and give me notice so that I can get some advertising from the merchants, you will provide a favor for me, an old friend and brother. Now, Brother Brigham Young and the 12 were very helpful to him, and he had plenty of jobs, plenty of things to keep him going, until the 1860s when he was getting to feel a lot older, especially, I guess, as he was approaching 75. Okay, then he wrote to Brother Cannon in April, I wish to unfold my circumstances to you. I am in my 75th year and cannot labor as I used to. Makes sense? I have 3 families dependent mostly for me. He had 2 wives and children that were dependent on him as well as his own family. And I labor in the endowments, and they draw flour from the tithing office. Butter and meat lately have been refused. I don't know why. To supply my living, I used to contribute an almanac for 1866 and also 1867 to put them into one volume. But he goes on to say that Brother Carrington, who is the editor of the Desert News, won't work with me. So what can you do to help me? And then he finally wrote later in 1866, this is the last known statement from him, Brigham Young. I'm about 75 years old and somewhat needy, and would be very glad to again act as chaplain. And he had done that in the Utah Territorial Legislature before, and that brought some salary. It's kind of big. Can I be that again in the legislature assembly the coming season? I have not been able to make an arrangement with Brother Carrington, that's the editor of the Desert News. I have a lot of evidence that those two didn't get along with each other. I now have the manuscripts for this year and 1867 ready for the press, and Godby says he'll pay $50 for the printing, and the almanac will certainly be good for the balances, and I need to get advertising. Please help me get supplies so I can take care of my 3 families. That's the last part he was saying. So it wasn't an easy time for him. This was the last almanac that came out in 1865, and as I have studied its pages, it was mediocre in its contributions compared to some of the other ones. It just wasn't quite up to the same standard, and I think maybe they decided, okay, it's over, we're not going to do it anymore. But he was begging for the chance to get that anyway in his elderly age and losing, I guess, the faculties of his mind. Okay, back to how he looked when he was younger. William Wines Phelps was born February 1792 in Dover Township, Morris County, New Jersey, as the first son of 12 kids, of Enon Phelps and the Editorial goldsmith. His curious middle name, you probably wondered about that many times, where does Wines come from? Comes from a neighbor, a famous general in the Revolutionary War, and a powerful person in the Dover area, that contributed all kinds of philanthropic things, a lot of money. His name was William Wines, and so he's named after him. And when William Wines made out his will, he gave to nieces and nephews. He didn't have his own children, and then he gave an equal portion to Mahitable that had been kind of raised in his family, at least close to his family, all the life. And so it would make sense that his mother would call him William Wines Phelps. Let's see, here we go. Dover Hanover Township, Morris County, New Jersey. Over here you see the Morris County. Lots of fantastic things happen in Morris County, still do. It's not too far away from New York City. And this was the portion over where he lived. And then we get over to the rest of his life. He lived in Homer Township from 1800 to 1815. Enon Phelps got bounty lands for Revolutionary War veterans. A lot of prime property, but it all had to be improved, and a lot of the woody, the forestry had to be taken out in order to make it thrive, but it really was a good place. And Homer, the village, was bigger than Cortland, the village, at that stage, although Cortland, the village, developed into a nice, sizable place beginning about 1815, and has outstripped Homer and continues to do so today. As an adult, Phelps displayed a vast array of knowledge of all kinds of things. Printing, surveying, languages. He claimed to have a facility with 16 languages. He certainly emphasized his work with Hebrew, which he had studied in Portland, and Latin, some Greek, and some of his essays, even in the name of Joseph Smith. He would throw out these linguistic phrases, kind of in a show-offy way. And B.H. Roberts, who edited the history of the church in the early part of the 1900s, realized that the platform for Joseph Smith's presidential run, Views, was called Views, was actually ghostwritten by Phelps. They all pretty much knew that, and it was well known even at the time. And he said, this does not reflect well upon Joseph Smith, all these other things. It's just too bad that was all in there like that, with all these languages. Many understood languages: geography, history, topography, meteorology. He really did know about weather. Horticulture, really good at that. Climatology, rhetoric, and theology. Look at all those things. He taught himself, mostly through his many books, although he probably received some tutoring, and some of the tutoring could have come with the monies from William Warren's. He apprenticed as a printer. Joseph Smith always called him William in the Revelations and in his letters, but he always called himself W.W. Phelps. So this is how we sign off in these letters. As a publisher of a newspaper in Canandaigua, it was W.W. Phelps and Company. When they went to Jackson County, Missouri, and established the church-owned part of the United Order system, printing office, it still was called W.W. Phelps and Company. He went by that. This is his wife, Sally. Get back to this. You may know that the War of 1812 actually lasted until 1815. And at the end of the war, and he had participated in it, we don't have a lot about it. We know that he was a fifer or a flute player or a pickerel player in his regiment. That we know. And he kept up with the flute thereafter. New York recruits fought on the Canadian front quite a bit off here to the right. Anyway, Smyrna, you can see that. He went through there apparently, maybe on some business. And that's where he met Sally Waterman. And he married her there. And then they moved over to Cortland. In 1815, 1820, he worked in the printing business, but as an assistant and a hand, as they called him. But in 1820, he became an editor of a politically partisan newspaper in the city of Cortland. And all newspapers at that time were on one political party or another, usually two, the Federalists versus the Republican Democrats. And that had been roiling ever since the election in 1800 between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And so all these newspapers, and he was involved with that. He verbally attacked his foes, and they verbally attacked him back. In 1827, he helped found a religious, a social, a political movement that was called anti-Masonry. It was very populist. It accused Freemasons of murder, but also of secretly dominating elected and appointed political offices, and of ruthlessly using elitism and favoritism. And it became a political party in the state of New York. And then eventually in 12 states. And they ran candidates and won several legislative seats. They didn't come too far apart in actually electing a governor. Anti-Masonry was determined to oust these members of Freemasonry from local and national political offices, and so he went from Cortland to Trumansburg. You can see that that's on the other side of the lake. That's a smaller town. It was called the Lake Light. But he, like I said, it helped, and folks said, you got to go to Canandaigua, that's the big place. That was the largest place actually in Western New York at the time. And he set up the Ontario Phoenix beginning in 1828, and he and his family lived there through 1831. And that's an important little thing here. While investigating Mormonism, he became acquainted personally with some of the key figures in the birth of the Latter-day Saint faith. He met them, interchanged ideas, talked with them. Joseph Smith Jr., Joseph Smith Sr., Samuel H. Smith. Joseph Smith Sr. and Samuel H. Smith were actually incarcerated in the Canandaigua, Ontario County Jail for preaching. And he became acquainted with them there. Sidney Rigdon, he met with Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon for several hours. Thomas Marsh actually lived in Canandaigua at the time. He continued to investigate what was going on with the Mormons. And all the newspaper editors knew the other newspaper editors. And as you know, in Palmyra, the notice came out on March 26th. The Book of Mormon was now available for sale. It was finished, bound and everything, ready March 26th. Well, he heard about this. He already knew a little bit about Joseph Smith anyway. He had dreams about this type of thing, and so he was interested. So he went to Palmyra, only 12 miles away from Canandaigua, and purchased several copies and put them up for sale in his bookstore, which was part of his printing office. He and Sally read it from cover to cover right away. And he came to know that it was true, that it was correct, it was God's Word. And corresponded with the Bible. He was converted right soon then. The trouble was, though, it was 1830, and the elections were going to be later in the year, and he had participated a lot in 1828 in helping to elect people. Now he wanted to do more, and so where do I go exactly? And he had struggles within himself, but people heard about it. Some other newspaper editors that mocked him, like up in Rochester. And the anti-Masonry businessmen who were supporting him got annoyed that he was interested in Mormonism. And so they called in some debts that he had. And the state of New York still had this debtor jailing law that if you couldn't pay your debts, you had to go to jail. And so he was taken to Lyons, which was the county seat. You can see where Lyons is. And put in jail for about 10 days. He was able to get out some of his feelings, and they were published in another newspaper in Geneva, which was also nearby. And he threatened to expose a lot of things, and they did get him out. It's a sad thing that these charges were owing a few dollars, that it was usually on credit. When he was finally released in June 1831, Phelps resigned his editorship and took his family to Kirtland, Ohio to join the Mormons. He responded later in his life that he studied the Bible from start to finish. This is a cover piece for the King James Version, something like he might have seen in his Bible. He certainly knew his Bible. He knew it better than Joseph Smith. And like we say, he got several copies of the Book of Mormon, and it looked similar like this in those days. Last month, my wife and I were in Kirtland for a conference. And we went up to the shores of Lake Erie. This is Lake Erie. a lot of the saints from New York came by schooner across from Buffalo to Fairport Harbor. And this lighthouse is there. Over here is a marker that's been put up by our people that explains how important Fairport Harbor was to the Latter-day Saints in first coming to Ohio from New York, and was used again and again and again. So that was pretty neat. Remember that when Phelps then left in 1831, he probably was pretty much penniless, didn't have any money, and everybody just glad to get out from under that debt. He had made, I guess, a fairly decent living, but now he didn't have anything. He convinced his family to join him. Of course, the man's statement was the rule of the family, so that was fine. And he took all 6 of the children. The oldest was Sabrina, she was 16. And then there was Hitty and Waterman, and then Sarah and Henry, and little Mary, who was not even 1 yet. That wouldn't have been easy. From Fairport Harbor to Kirtland is 12 miles, and there's an Ohio Trail, they call it. And you can actually follow that trail today. They have signs up, Ohio Trail. And we took a lot of that, and it went right up to the Morley farm, which was east of Kirtland. And that's where Joseph Smith and Emma and family were living at the moment in June of 1831 when they arrived. And Joseph was ready to leave in a week to go to Missouri to identify the land of Zion. And he'd already received revelations on the subject, and everybody knew he was going. Sidney would go with him and some others. The church does own that property now where the Morley farm is. And this is the pathway that gets down to that. And he asked for a revelation and got it. This is chapter 57 of the Book of Commandments, as he started to publish it in Missouri. A revelation to William given in Kirtland, Ohio, 1831. Thou art called and chosen after thou art been baptized in water, which if you do with an eye single to my glory, you shall have a remission of your sins. It indicates that he's going to help with the printing. Well, it turned out in section 57, which came a couple months later in Independence, that he was to take the lead in printing. The printer unto the church in Albury County would be his assistant, and that's how it turned out. This is an early handwriting of that Revelation, section 57, when he was called to be printer unto the church, as we've already seen. This is where they lived. You can see his home, and where his press was, the store right close to it, the courthouse right close to it, the temple site a little ways away. You can walk to it, it's only half a mile, and the Partridge home and the other Mormon lands. This was the first edition of the Evening and the Morning Star in June of 1832, and it went through July of 1833 when it was destroyed by the mob of rats who wanted nothing to do with it. And at the location of his printing office in the pavement outside that on the street, there is this marker, and I took a photo of it. Church printer W.W. Phelps published the first paper in Independence. And remember, we're dealing with 800 miles apart. And then the Saints got some help from Zion's camp, hopefully to get back into Jackson County. It didn't work out, as you know. There was a revelation of Fishing River. This comes from the Doctrine and Covenants section, and they start calling it section. That would be 52. And in it, there were several people appointed to buy more lands, not necessarily in Jackson County anymore, but more lands in Missouri. And many of the elders, the first elders, were to go to Kirtland to get their endowment from on high. And they specifically were called to do some of this. This is what it says. A council of high priests, this is one day after the revelation, met according to revelation in order to choose some of the first elders to receive their endowments, being appointed by the voice of the Spirit, through Brother Joseph Jr., President of the Church of Christ. Proceeding first, Edward Partridge is called and chosen as to go to Kirtland to receive his endowment with power from on high, and also stand in his office as bishop to purchase lands in Missouri. William W. Phelps is called and chosen, and it is appointed unto him to receive his endowment with power from on high, and help carry on the printing establishment in Kirtland until Zion is redeemed. And then there were several others as well. Then a couple weeks later, in Liberty, Joseph Smith at the farm plantation, slaves and all, of Colonel Arthur where he was friendly to the Mormons. They held a conference, and a Missouri presidency was established. The high priest of Zion assembled for the purpose of organizing a general council of high priests. There had already been a high council and a presidency of such high council established in Kirtland for the purpose of settling important business that might come before them that could not be settled by the bishop. Well, David Whitmer would be the president of the Missouri Church, assisted by William W. Phelps and John Whitmer, and then 12 others. At that very location, we now have a monument. On 4 sides it talks about Zion's camp and the settlements and being driven from Jackson County. On this side, it does talk about this first Missouri presidency. It mentions first stake presidency. The word stake was not used in Missouri until 1838, when Joseph Smith came and made it very plain in Far West that the first presidency, consisting at that point of himself, Sidney, and Hiram Smith, was over any other presidents, and he started calling the presidency of the church in Missouri a stake. There wasn't a stake until then, although it looked like a modern-day stake in many ways. Okay, we went back to Ohio. You can see the Joseph Smith home, where he actually boarded, which is right next to the printing office that he worked in every day, and the temple that was being built. He wrote to his wife all kinds of fantastic things. I've published on this, and the biography has a whole lot on it. But this is one very interesting thing. A new idea, Sally. If you and I continue faithful to the end, we are certain to be one in the Lord throughout eternity. This is one of the most glorious consolations we can have in the flesh. This is the first intimation in anything that we have in Mormon writings, even though it's just 11, to talk about the eternal nature of the marriage covenant. It got to be big in Nauvoo, as we know, but he was already talking about it, and he was with Joseph Smith all along. This shows how the church was organized. It's true that the first presidency, where the presidency of the high priesthood, answered simultaneously as president and presidency of the church in Kirtland, and that was known as a stake, because you see, a stake is supposed to be a stake of Zion, and Zion was in Missouri. You see, that's how they called it. Zion was Missouri at that time. We now understand Zion to be much more than that, but Kirtland was a stake of Zion, and this was Zion. They actually called it that a lot of times. They also called it the church in Missouri, or the Missouri Church Presidency. And the Quorum of the 12, which had been called in 1835, were the traveling high council, and their duties were not here, not in Missouri, not in Kirtland. Their duties at that point were to travel and set up branches everywhere and set up the preaching of the gospel everywhere. And they had the 70 that would be underneath them. Later, they did get in Nauvoo the responsibility to be under the first presidency in governing the whole church. But this was not the case in 1835. We had 9 presidents of the church, actually, in Ohio in 1835. There were 3, Joseph, Sidney, and at that point, Frederick G. Williams. And then Joseph had called other fellows as presidents. Oliver Cowdery was actually called to be assistant president and put over Sidney and Williams. And then he called 2 other presidents in Ohio, Joseph Smith Sr., his father, and Hiram Smith, his older brother. And then we had the 3 that joined them in Ohio, and they were the presidency from Missouri, and that's 9 presidents. And they ran the church as a group. They were called the Council of Presidents, and they ran the church for those 11 months, the 9 presidents. And when Joseph Smith dedicated the Kirtland Temple, he prayed for the presidents, and they were called prophets and seers as well as he was. This is the National Journal Advocate. You get a view of it. He worked with Joseph Smith and these people in producing the Doctrine and Covenants. The top volume there is the Book of Commandments. He published the Sacred Hymns, 90 hymns in that. It looks like he wrote from scratch about 30 of those. He amended the wording of another 10 or so of the 90. Some of the hymns have been selected by Emma Smith from Protestant sources, and he wrote the preface to it. This is an example of the letter he wrote to Sally. It's moving fast here. Notice here that Clay County Mo, this M-O, doesn't date to the modern era. They called it Mo back then for Missouri. In just a couple minutes here, I'll give you a feeling for some of the teachings he gave. about the Book of Mormon. Whenever I have meditated upon the Book of Mormon and looked ahead at the glory which will be brought to pass by that and the servants of God, I have been filled with hope, filled with light, filled with joy, filled with satisfaction. What a wonderful volume. What a glorious treasure. By that book I received the fullness of the everlasting gospel. By that book I found the new covenants. By that book I learned when the Lord would gather scattered Israel. By that book I saw that the Lord had set his hand the second time to gather his people and place them in their own land. And by that book I learned that the poor Indians of America were some of the remnants of Israel. By that book I learned that the New Jerusalem, even Zion, was to be built upon this continent. By that book I found a key to the holy prophets, and by that book began to unfold the mysteries of God. And in his writings he talked a lot about the gathering. These quotations are in the book. However, if you would like all of these slides, I can even send you that. But the time's up.